Hey, thank you, everyone. I think we can get started. Welcome back to the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate seminar series. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dan Griffin, who is Assistant Professor, Department of Geography, Environment, and Society. Dan received his PhD in Geography from the University of Arizona back in 2013. He is a paleoclimatologist with a number of ongoing NSF projects related to high-resolution paleoclimatology. He's also interested in fire climate vegetation dynamics in oak savanna ecosystems, teaches courses in biogeography and climatology here at the U. And his research has been featured in a number of media outlets, including the BBC, National Public Radio, did a recent story on tree trunks store trove of useful data. So we're really excited to hear Dan's story today. He's going to be talking about hydroclimate extremes and tree rings in California.
Before you start, can we do a quick pause to get audio and video set up?
Sure.
So it was looking good on Zoom beforehand, but now it looks like
Did I lose the screen share?
it went on to like I think 2 displays. So
I see.
you can see your other desktop.
Nope.
This is focused.
That's not what you want. Okay. It worked a moment ago.
I know it was, it was looking good.
Okay. Let's just try this and see. No.
Here we go.
It was back. It's lag. There's a lag. Let's see if this catches.
All right. And then you're clipped on, so I think we're good to go.
Okay. Mic check. It's testing. It's working.
Yeah.
It's not as easy as it was in the view graph days. Thanks everybody for coming today. I'm Dan Griffin. It's a bit of a grandiose title. I'll try to hit on some notes for this. I'd like to start off thanking Professor Griffiths for the invitation to come here and join. It's been a while since I was in the department. It's nice to see some familiar faces and some new faces, and I'll be happy to stick around after and chat if folks are keen. Thanks for the nice introduction. I'd like to take just a moment and introduce a little bit more about myself and my lab group. I'm a dad and a PI, and I've got this incredible team of folks that I work with in the College of Liberal Arts, in the Department of Geography, including some folks who are here with me, Matt Trumper and Sandy Wong. I have spent a lot of time in my time at Minnesota working with undergrads on research, and it turns out for a high volume, high throughput tree ring lab, undergrads are anxious, interested, and quite useful. And so, yeah, I've got a great group of folks in the lab this semester, and I'll mention them again near the end. In terms of the things that we do in my group, I thought I'd hit on some of the kind of broad strokes and funnel down towards today's talk. Something I'm really passionate about, and I'm always trying to figure out how to fit into the funding profile, is identification, mapping, and conservation of old growth. And so I think in this rapidly changing time when environmental systems are upended, it's worth noting that there are ancient trees that can be found in most places across North America. There is old growth here in Minnesota. You can see we recently sampled some 300-plus-year-old bur oaks in Whitewater State Park. We've sampled 300-plus-year-old bur oaks right here in the metro area. I was having an interesting conversation about that a moment ago. Trees like this have excellent paleoclimate potential for Minnesota. I'll circle back to that in a minute. Further afield in North America, which is mostly where I work, we've recently identified the oldest known living trees in eastern North America, bald cypress growing in a backwater, blackwater swamp right outside of Wilmington, are over 2,500 years old. And of course, also we've worked out west a great deal. Here's some Rocky Mountain bristlecone pine, that's Pinus aristata, growing in the rain shadow of the Collegiate Peaks. So just up the hill from Buena Vista, if you might know where that place is. So yeah, we work with old growth. We have to go to these places, we have to find them and spend time there and try to understand the systems. And of course, these are the individual trees from which we collect data that we try to use downstream. As Professor Griffiths mentioned, I'm really quite interested in the way that climate manifests as a forcing mechanism throughout ecosystem processes. And so students in my group and collaborators, we've worked on things in Minnesota and up on the North Slope of Alaska and out west. I'll actually circle back and make reference to this. But of course, climate acts as a bottom-up driver. Ecologists would call it a bottom-up forcing on primary productivity in ecosystems. And there's some big questions about how ecosystem processes may be synchronizing as the climate system becomes more amplified with more frequent and more intense extreme events. And then bread and butter for me has been paleoclimatology. This is what I studied in grad school and have continued to kind of pay the bills with. So I'll talk about the way that we're using paleoclimate to benchmark extreme events. I'll cover this today. I'm collaborating with paleoclimatologists who are working in marine systems. I won't have too much time to talk about these incredible records that we've been building from the Pacific gooey duck, which is a long-lived marine bivalve. It can live to be up to 150 years old. The shells fall into the coastal sediments and then accumulate, and so we can stitch records together. And a recent PhD graduate from the University of Arizona has stitched together a nearly 1,000-year-long continuous record of Pacific gooey duck, which responds to localized sea surface temperature. So it's an in situ proxy for paleo-ocean conditions. And then of course, bread and butter is tree rings in North America. And we've been doing a lot with reconstructions that range from the local up to the continental scale with meta-analyses to boot. And then something I've been spending way too much time on lately, but has been a real pet project for me, is trying to figure out how to advance open science standards in basic tree ring data development. And so I'm partnering with some technologists as well as some students from the colleges of CLA and engineering. And we're trying to develop, harness, and integrate emerging technologies for replicable tree ring data development. So on the left, you can see our automated gigapixel macro photography system. The center panel shows you the individual images that are obtained in the focus stack. And then on the right, you can see the digital distillation process that builds up a composite of all the pixels that are absolutely in focus. We do this for comprehensive coverage of our specimens. And in the end, we produce a flat field orthomosaic that is rectilinear and suitable for high resolution microscopy, and we believe is also quite ready for computer vision. So we're trying to build digital image archives that are suitable not just for the research questions that we have today, but also for the questions that we can see coming down the pike. And incidentally, this is pretty serious data. We do this for 20 or 30 cores in a collection, and then we've got dozens of collections. Each one of those cores might be 2 or 3 gigabytes in size. So we are continuing to develop a cloud native software platform to facilitate data curation, image analysis, visualization, and education and outreach with tree rings, which I believe is perhaps the most potent gateway to environmental systems thinking. And ultimately, we're trying to get tree rings in front of students at the national scale. So I think there's great opportunity for that. And it's been really fun for us. I won't talk too much more about that, but I'm glad to have gotten in a decent little plug. Okay, so the unifying factor for all of this is dendrochronology, which of course, dendrochronology is the study of time with trees, and it is just a research tool, but it's also so much more than that. Dendrochronology is this nexus of plant biology, tree physiology, environmental systems, time series statistics, so on and so forth. And so a little bit of Dendro 101, here's a pen and ink that illustrates your typical conifer tree ring specimen growing from the left toward the right. The annual ring boundaries are shown by the arrows on the top. We've got some of the cellular structures of relevance indicated on the bottom. And in green, I've highlighted the vascular cambium. This is meristematic tissue. These are stem cells that are the primary living tissue for the plant. These occur in a paper-thin band between the wood, the xylem, and the bark, the phloem. And during the active growing season, which incidentally is happening right now, it's just starting, the vascular cambium adds additional cells, and those cells start to differentiate to form this wood to the inside, bark to the outside. And it's through this process of wood formation, we call it xylogenesis. It's through this process that trees encode information from their environment. And so trees are not perfect recorders of environmental systems, but rather they are a biological entity, and they provide us with great perspective and records, but we do have to be well grounded in an understanding of the environmental system, as well as an understanding of the plant biology and the physiology, as well as the phenological processes, like when are the trees leafing out, when are they growing, when do they stop growing, et cetera. And then the other thing I'd be remiss not to mention is the idea of cross-dating. Cross-dating is our method of geochronology through which we do systematic pairwise comparison of the relative patterns we see in tree rings. This might be ring width, it might be ring color, it might be wood density. It's less about the absolute rate of growth or the absolute patterns and more about the relative patterns. And because climate acts as a bottom-up forcing in the ecological sense, not top-down, but bottom-up, influencing tree growth, we see trees pulsing together on the landscape from year to year in terms of their seasonal or annual scale variability. And I'll say more about that in a moment. Okay, so that's my introduction today. I want to try to hit on trees as a bit of a vessel for exploring narratives about extreme events and hydroclimate extremes in California, which I would argue is really an idealized case study, because California is experiencing rapid climate change, particularly with respect to temperature, and the climate system there has a strong pulsing through environmental systems on both the landscape and the terrestrial systems, as well as the marine systems. So I want to talk about some kind of basic dendroclimatology and how we're using blue oaks to benchmark extreme events and provide longer term multi-century context. I want to walk through really briefly evidence that we've gathered that shows how climate is acting as bottom-up forcing in ecosystem productivity in both marine systems and terrestrial systems, but ironically how that productivity is inverted relative to those systems, all synchronized by the North Pacific High and its variability. And then finally, I want to put a bit of a plug in for this project that's ongoing. We're trying to understand how the subpolar jet stream behaves during the winter season using tree rings, which is no small feat because for the most part, trees don't grow during winter. And so I'll talk more about that. Okay, just to orient us, here's a map that illustrates California and Nevada mean annual precipitation. This is PRISM data. It's a little bit dated, but I don't think the mean statistics would vary too much. Apologies for the color ramp that is a rainbow. This is a bit of a dated slide. I promise I'm getting with the program to kill the rainbow. But the point I want to make here is California really is a tale of two cities. You can see most of the state is semi-arid with precipitation that is less than 10 inches or so. And in other places, there's water aplenty. So in the Sierra Nevada and in the Coast Ranges, we have precipitation that exceeds a meter on the annual. If we look at the seasonal breakdown here, I've got this dot plot that I've created. Yeah, indeed, this is statewide data for 1896 through 2014. And so each one of those circles represents an individual month recorded with rain gauge data and then interpolated in a robust way at the spatial scale. And then the horizontal lines correspond to the median value. That's the 50th percentile. The takeaway here is that it is a Mediterranean type climate regime. Arguably, it epitomizes the Mediterranean type regime more so than the Mediterranean itself. And so namely, what I'm talking about here is the fact that winters are the time of year when they have precipitation. And when I say winter, I mean the winter half year from roughly October through April. They see over 95% of the annual precipitation in California. And like the Mediterranean type regime in California, there's an incredible amount of variability from one year to the next. So here I've summed precipitation on what should arguably be California's water year from from July through June. This is data from the state climate tracker. Wow, I'm going to try to kill this. Let's see if I can. Oh, can't. The mouse sometimes disappears on the Zoom window, so you'll have to read behind the closed captioning statement there. Interannual variability in precipitation is dramatic in California. And you can see this where we have incredibly dry years like 1924, 1976, 1977. That's a big important moment in time for folks thinking about Northern Hemisphere climate at the synoptic scale. And then other incredibly dry years like 2021, which I believe is the driest year on record for this particular period of time in California. In terms of trend for this figure and the next two I'll show, I fit one from 1970 to 2022. I don't want to overthink trend estimation, but I think that's a reasonable time period to think about how things have changed over the last 53 years or so. So a lot of variability from one year to the next, potentially some rising variability, trend and variability, which is notoriously difficult to nail down in a statistically robust way. One thing that's changing really dramatically is temperature in California. Of course, this is the case for minimum temperature, like many parts of the temperate latitudes, but also in California, the maximum temperature, this is mean annual maximum temperature for the period July through June, 1896 to 2022. And you can see a pretty dramatic increase with many of the record years having occurred in the most recent decade. Finally, I would show you the Palmer Drought Severity Index, which of course is a moisture balance index that is modeled, and precipitation acts as a positive input and temperature acts as a negative input. So high precipitation tends to contribute to wet PDSI values, which are positive. High temperatures tend to contribute to low PDSI values, which are negative, and vice versa. And with this, you can see here that over this instrumental period, 1976, 77 stand out, and then some other really dry years like 2014 and 2021, as well as 2022. Of course, that's not what's happening this winter in California, and I'll gesture to that in just a moment. So, boilerplate question for paleoclimatology. Does the limited observational data set adequately represent the range of variability that we would have expected based on natural fluctuations in the climate system? I'm not thinking here so much about anthropogenic contributions, but really, does this relatively short period of time represent an actual, a reasonable estimate for the range of variability we would expect in a highly stochastic climate system? And of course, probably not is the boilerplate answer, but this is the boilerplate question. And let's talk about Dendroclimatology 101. So I know there's some paleo folks in the room, and so bear with me as I try to go through this. I also understand this is a super diverse department in terms of the thematic expertise that's represented. So I wanted to try to orient you all to what I would consider to be a quantitatively rigorous and process-oriented framework. These are the basics for how we do paleoclimate with tree rings. First, we spend an inordinate amount of time creating tree ring data. And this is something that we specialize in my group. And indeed, there are a rapidly exploding number of data analysts and meta-analysts out there, but there seem to be a dwindling number of people who actually have the chops to create really high quality data that is needed to answer questions for which is not presently available. So we spend a lot of time thinking about where we will select trees to sample, which trees we would target. It turns out tree ring sampling is fairly cheap. So we do a lot of sampling with replication. It's quite common for us to sample 20, 30, 50, maybe even 100 trees at a site, dozens of sites across the region. And I think all of that is probably less expensive than what your colleague Peter Neff would do at just one place. You're trying to put a hole in the ice sheet. I gestured to cross dating. This is something we spend a lot of time on. This is something that the students new to my group this semester are really in the trenches of right now, trying to sort out the patterns of wood anatomy, reconciling those against our datum in time, this most recent year from which the trees were growing. And yeah, they're in the trenches. And it turns out our online cloud hosted system actually makes this process much more transparent. We think that's one of its principal values. We measure different types of parameters of tree rings. We might do chemistry. We might do something as simple as ring width for the annual increment. And then we spend a lot of time thinking about the standardization, the statistical treatment of these tree ring data, which we know have long-term trends not related to climate variability that need to be expunged. In the next step towards kind of paleoclimate with tree rings, we spend a lot of time in what I would call the screening phase. So we go deep into the weeds of correlation analyses with various climate parameters. So we're correlating the annual tree ring records against monthly, seasonal, maybe even daily. One of the folks in my group has been moving into daily response analyses. We do focus in the process orientation on the sign of the response. So if we're correlating against precipitation and it's a water limited system, we'd expect a positive correlation. We also look at the seasonality of that response. Do we think that aligns with the seasonality of the hydroclimate regime as well as the seasonality of tree growth in terms of the phenology? And then finally, more importantly than ever, we spend a lot of time thinking about the time stability of this response. As we move into these non-analog climates, there are some questions that some folks in the room might remember under the auspice of divergence. Remember the hockey stick, Mann-Bradley-Hughes, climate gate. There are questions. Are trees responding to climate in the ways that they always have? And so we get deep into the woods, into the rabbit hole in terms of evaluating the time stability. And again, all of this is happening in what I believe is a reasonable systems orientation. And from this, we can move towards the subset of candidates that we might consider for quantitative reconstruction. In terms of the reconstruction, there are different approaches. We can do everything from neural networks to data assimilation. It turns out, just like you'd expect, it's garbage in, garbage out. So at the end of the day, regression actually gets you most of the way there. If you've got good data, arguably, it's the best approach, I would say, based on what I've seen. But we do calibration. It's typically regression based. Maybe there's principal components, maybe not. We always hold data back, independent data for verification. So we've got statistical rigor. We're trying to meet the assumptions of regression modeling. And then we do our retrodiction with regression error estimation. In many cases, we're now repeating this process sequentially across a gridded field. So we're actually able to produce a gridded set of climate reconstructions, which facilitate analyses of patterns across space and back through time. Does that make sense? Did I do okay there? Do you guys have any burning questions about that? I'm actually not going to go into the weeds of any of this. I'm going to ask you just to trust me. Okay, I'd like to now move on to talk about what might be my favorite tree. I don't know. Fine tree, quercus. I think it roughly translates to fine tree from Latin. And I would argue that quercus are the best. I think they're the best trees. They're more recently evolved than a lot of the gymnosperms, of course. They don't live to be quite as old, but they're exquisite in so many ways. I've spent a lot of time over the last 20 years focusing on Quercus douglasii, which is a California endemic. I don't know whether this made it into the ad, but this is a photo that Matt and I took in Sequoia National Park last summer. And so I think it's interesting and noteworthy that for a state and for a park that's well known for some of the most famous trees on earth, there are probably hundreds of thousands of ancient oaks that are unsung, unrecognized, largely unseen by the hundreds of thousands of visitors that make their way through the system every year. Blue oak occurs as what some have called a dirty bathtub ring, roughly around the Central Valley. It occurs in the foothills. It occurs at the ecological transition zone, or the ecotone between the grasslands, where it's too dry and too hot to support tree growth, and the conifer systems, or the chaparral systems that we see at higher elevation. And so the oak woodlands, I would argue, are iconic to California. People that have spent time there have seen these. And of course, these were really important. These have been really important for humans that have been living in this system for, what do we think now, 22,000 years, roughly, thereabouts. Ironically, oaks have been overlooked by dendrochronologists for almost a century. And I think this makes sense. You've got the state that has the oldest trees, the bristlecone pines, the fattest trees, the giant sequoias, the tallest trees, the redwoods, a bunch of other trees like Joshua trees, not actually trees. But I think, there is a lot of low-hanging fruit in California, and I think it's amazing that the oak woodlands have been overlooked, and we're trying to sort that out in my group. We're not the only ones, of course, but we're making pretty good headway. As I mentioned, they occur at the lower forest border. So it's this transition zone, ecologically speaking, between the grasslands, which are just out of frame, and the chaparral and mixed conifer forests you see up on the hillside. Incidentally, this is a shot from the Kaweah River, the North Fork of the Kaweah River in Sequoia National Park, if you've been there, right outside of Three Rivers. And so this is an exceptionally dry ecological niche. These trees are really hanging on at the margin of climate that will support tree growth in the Golden State. And the other thing is that they're everywhere and they tend to be old. They also tend to be hollow and gnarly. And so they weren't really worth cutting down for timber production. Of course, they were cut for firewood and folks continue to use them, but just about everywhere we've been in California, we see blue oaks that are in the 200, 300, 400, maybe even 500-year age class, like we can see for this particular tree. So way back when I was a master's student about 20 years ago, I worked on a project to evaluate the background hydroclimatology of San Francisco Bay. It turns out that water inflow to San Francisco Bay is a contentious issue. You know, it turns out that it's important for agriculture. It turns out it's also important for iconic species like the Delta smelt, and it's super political. Of course, California has the most engineered water resources systems in human history. You know, water is not equally distributed across the state naturally, but it has been plumbed across the state so that it's sent to the places that arguably need it the most. So here's a network of tree ring chronologies that we made about 20 years ago from California blue oak. Each one of these locations has about 50 to 100 trees. We're sampling with replication. We use an increment borer to collect samples from living trees. We use a chainsaw to collect wood from dead material, and that allows us to make really nice long records. Back in the lab, we spent a lot of time focusing on this meticulous process of cross-dating and ring width measurement. Historically, we did this under the microscope, and these are some photos I took through the microscope almost 10 years ago at this point. And you can see 2014 as the smallest growth ring in each of these samples, except for this one, where it is not included. It is what we would call locally absent. In other words, at the site where our core was collected, the tree did not actually grow that year. Somewhere else in the tree, the cambium did produce wood, but not in the place our core sample was collected. And here's Grace Hansen. She's a graduating senior this year in industrial and systems engineering. She's been one of the main players in our efforts, along with Jess Thorne and Malik Nuseba and others, to develop this cloud native system for tree ring image visualization and measurement. And it turns out it's all a lot easier than it used to be. So for those in my group paying attention, you've got it better than it used to be, I promise. And then we move into kind of time series land. And so each one of the curves here that's shown is an individual tree core. And just for grins, I tossed in one of the dead logs. Routinely, we would have many more of the dead logs, and those can allow us to extend our temporal coverage substantially back in time. I would draw your attention to the way that these ring width patterns co-vary across time. And so, for example, look at this moment of decadal scale drought in the 1920s. Turns out in Central California, the Dust Bowl really arrived a little bit early and left before the Dust Bowl kind of migrated up into the North Central Plains, including Minnesota. We can also see spikes in prominent variability. We can see in the site level average chronology, we've got really high growth years that correspond to, what am I working with here? This surely must be 1998. Surely 1983 would be in there, 1941. There are other really big rings. I will say that for most of our data, it is the dry years that synchronize across the wooded ecosystem. And so the really strong marker years that we see in our chronology and cross dating for most sites tend to be the dry years. And so I'm trying to foreshadow a little bit here to say that some of our sites actually do really well on the wet side. And that's an area we're trying to develop improved understanding and focus, and I'll explain that. But yeah, time series standardization. So first we do some basic detrending to remove the geometric and biological patterns from the tree ring time series. Sometimes we do some autoregressive modeling and pre-whitening. It turns out we don't really need to do that with the oaks so much. They don't have much autocorrelation structure. And then we do a robust mean value function. So we calculate a site level average, if you will. And this is our chronology going back in time. The interannual values, sorry, Amy, thanks for tracking me with the camera. Interannual values are shown in blue, and then I think I fit a 5-year cubic smoothing spline to kind of highlight some of the interesting subdecadal to maybe multi-decadal variability, including, for example, that we see during the period of time following the 16th century megadrought. Okay, so in our climate response space, we claim absolute certainty in the calendar year dating. We assign a specific calendar year to every growth ring in the time series, and then we smash those together in terms of our population average. And when you've got calendar year data, you got to do something with that. And so we can correlate the tree growth time series against climate observations, in this case at the monthly time step. And so I've got the magnitude of Pearson's precipitation correlation, or maybe it was Spearman, I can't remember, for individual months from, it looks like previous June through current June. And in this case, we can see statistically significant correlations roughly for the period from about October through April. That's with precipitation. And so precipitation is the overwhelmingly strong signal that we see here. I meant to go one at a time on those. Here we do partial correlation analyses with temperature. And the takeaway here is while there is some subtle temperature signal for blue oak, it's overwhelmingly precipitation. And then here is kind of an aggregate sense. This is the seasonal precipitation total versus the tree rings. And you can see a reasonable relationship there, 0.77. We can do better than that. Here's an exceptional individual. We've got one tree here, and this is ring width, not even standardized, versus precipitation in the Russian River Valley, which if you have a chance to go to the Russian River Valley in Northern California, highly recommended. Beautiful place. Of course, they've had incredible flooding there this winter. And a really strong correlation coefficient of 0.78 for this single tree. It turns out when you gather lots of trees at a site and lots of sites from the region, we see R squared values that are closer to 0.78. We can with blue oak. And a couple of us were talking about my former colleague, Scott St. George, who in 2014 published a meta-analysis. He took every tree ring chronology in the Northern Hemisphere and correlated against seasonal climate. And in his results, he says that the chronologies built from blue oak have the strongest winter precipitation signal, as well as the overall strongest effect size for climate of any observed across the Northern Hemisphere network. And so you can see our California blue oak chronologies here are spiking at over 0.8 for Pearson's correlation. So the point I'm trying to drive home here is that there's some special sauce in California with the blue oaks. This is really unrivaled in terms of the magnitude of the effect size that couples climate with tree growth and the potential, therefore, for skillful paleoclimate reconstruction, particularly focused around precipitation, because it turns out blue oaks in California start growing as early as February, certainly by March, and they are oftentimes done by the end of May, sometimes into early June. And so the timing of their wood formation is very closely lagging the timing of that precipitation pulse. And that's different than conifers. And I'll explain why that's important in just a moment. To further demonstrate the magnitude as well as the spatial pattern of the climate sensitivity, we have done spatial correlation. So we correlate the tree ring time series against every grid point, in this case in the PRISM precipitation data. These are three of our better performing chronologies. And you can see we've got correlations that for Rock Springs Ranch actually exceed the 0.9 threshold for a big swath of the Salinas Valley and the Central Valley as well. So the other point I want to make with these is by sampling sites across space, we have really nice spatial coverage. So yes, California's hydroclimate is fairly monolithic. The main, like the principal component of hydroclimate variability in California, the EOF is a statewide pattern. It absolutely is. But also the second EOF in a rotated kind of, Varimax sense is this north-south split. So there are subtle spatial patterns that matter for water resources, decision-making, and so forth. And these trees have the capacity to capture those signals. Okay, so I accepted this job in 2013. I was off on my way to do a postdoc at Woods Hole, and I saw this drought unfolding in California. And it happened pretty quick. Things escalated rapidly, as they do in the Golden State. And by 2014, much of the Central Valley, particularly the San Joaquin Valley, were in deep drought. And you saw these kinds of things in the news, pretty frequently. This is Lake Oroville, a massive bathtub ring. Of course, it doesn't look like that today, or at least it won't much longer. And then I saw this article. California's drought could be the worst in 500 years. And I thought, bullshit. There's no way. I'm intimately familiar with the record of moisture variability in California. Right now, I could stand here and rattle off a bunch of years that have tiny, tiny blue oak tree rings, like, for example, 1924, 1920, 1613, 1654. I could go on, I'll spare you. But the point is, I just didn't buy it. The thing is I totally trust Lynn Ingram. I just didn't buy it. She was at Berkeley at the time. And so with the flexibility of a NOAA climate and global change postdoc, I set out to test this hypothesis with Kevin Anchikaitis, my advisor. We went into the field, we updated some of the key chronologies that corresponded to the area where the drought was most severe. Here I've computed a regional average chronology. I'm correlating it against precipitation as I did before. And you can see there's strong correlations across the southern state climate divisions. Those are NOAA's climate divisions. And so we set off to the races, and we decided to test this with two approaches. First, we created a climate reconstruction for precipitation. In this case, we focused on October through June. And I'm not showing you the nitty-gritty statistical details here, but the point is that the tree ring data are shown in, gosh, don't get me lying, I should remember. I can't tell. But maybe that's good. Like, I can't tell which is the tree ring data and which is the climate data. I think that's okay. When you're explaining 80% of the variance, I think there's actually some question about where the error is coming in, like how much might be tree growth, how much might be the instrumental estimate, because they are estimates, right? And immediately I was validated. I found 2014, particularly in the long reconstruction here, we've got a reconstruction going back, in this case, over 700 years. Yeah, over 700 years of a precip story. There are many, many years, even in the observational period, where precipitation was lower than it had been in 2014. But of course, as I alluded to a moment ago, drought is not just a story about precipitation, which is mostly rainfall at the Blue Oak elevations. So for comparison, I turned to the North American Drought Atlas, the NADA as it's known, which of course is the life's work of Edward Cook, who's a Regents Professor at Columbia University's Tree Ring Lab, founder and director of that lab. I'm not real big on hero worship, but Ed is a hero for me. He's also been a champion for me. And the work that he's done is incredible. He's come up with this mechanism where he can take the irregular field of tree ring data and do this point-by-point reconstructions to produce a regular field of climate reconstructions. And the method is still widely deployed, and it's really interesting. So for this, we pulled out the grid points from the Drought Atlas that corresponded to the area we showed before, and we updated them by just appending the observational data, which that's one of the dirty little secrets of the Drought Atlas is after 1977, it's actually just instrumental observations. It's not tree ring data. But with this, all of a sudden, Lynn Ingram is vindicated. So it turns out 2014 is the lowest PDSI value in the observational data. And in the long-term reconstruction, which is very skillful, it is among the lowest values that we see in the last 1,200 years. If we ignored the 2 sigma confidence intervals, it would be the lowest drought PDSI value that we see. And so that's shown here. I've got this bivariate scatter plot, precipitation anomalies as the independent variable with PDSI as the dependent variable. And you can see here, there are many precipitation values lower, but there are not many PDSI values that are in the ballpark. This is in the single year sense. But of course, drought is a moving target. It's a multi-year phenomenon. So we can also do, Kevin cooked this up. It's a duration severity analysis. So we've got duration of drought events plotted on the x-axis, and then the cumulative PDSI severity on the y-axis. And here we see the 2012 through 2014 event as the most severe 3-year episode in this particular data set. So yeah, this was a exciting time for us, and there was some media coverage, and this is a result that we've continued to challenge and that others, Park Williams has continued to challenge, and the story hasn't really changed a lot. One thing we did do, I'm not really much on extreme event attribution, but we did try an early kind of thing with a detection and attribution, as you will. So we calculated PDSI 2 ways. We calculated PDSI with the observations for precipitation and temperature. That's where you get the red line. And then we calculated PDSI with the precip observations, but with climatology for temperature. And so we're kind of using that as our counterfactual, if you will. And that's where we came to this conclusion that indeed low precipitation causes drought, but here's the delta PDSI, high temperatures exacerbate it. And so it's a de novo approach to PDSI estimation. It's a little bit back of the envelope by kind of modern EEA standards, but still, I think it was a reasonable approach. And it stands true that it's the precipitation deficits that we saw during that early phase of this decadal drought were not really that unusual, but the record high temperatures were. Okay, this is not necessarily the Department of Dendroclimatology. It is the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate. And so I wanted to touch briefly on the synoptic scale drivers of a hydroclimate regime, thinking that might be of interest to some of you all. So for this, I'm going to turn to the Salinas River, which is one of my favorites. It's in Central California. Here I've calculated the water year total stream flow, and here I'm doing gridded correlations, stream flow versus precipitation. And here I would make the point that you can kind of see how monolithic California's hydroclimate variability is. It's really keying on Central California precip. We've also correlated it against 500 millibar geopotential height anomalies. This is the 20th century reanalysis product from NCEP-NCAR. And here you can see a very strong negative correlation between Salinas River hydroclimate and conditions over the North Pacific High, as well as over the tropical Indo-Pacific. And then we correlated it against temperature too, and the pattern is a little bit vague there. Of course, correlation is a broad brush, right? Correlation is a global scale analysis. And this isn't a talk about broad brush global correlations. I'm trying to talk to you all here about extreme events. And I would argue here with some composite anomaly maps that it's the extreme events that are really more interesting and more relevant for a bunch of ways, including ecosystems, which is where I'm driving to kind of conclude today. So here I've taken the dry years. So these are the 10th percentile flow events for Salinas River, and you can see precipitation, not surprising. We look at the geopotential height anomalies, and really fascinating, I think, to see how strongly the dry years in California map onto this PNA-like pattern. It's a PNA-like pattern, Pacific North America-like pattern with high pressure in the North Pacific sector, low pressure in the Icelandic sector, which arguably may be drifting over towards Hudson Bay lately. And then finally with SSTs, we see not much, I would say. And so the takeaway here is that drought conditions in California are really modulated principally by the North Pacific High. And of course, there's a lot of things that influence its variability, but it's really an atmospheric circulation story. What about the wet years, like the one we're seeing this year? Again, so now I'm looking at the 90th percentile flow events, precipitation, not particularly surprising here. Here are the 500 millibar geopotential height anomalies. And much like I expect we'll see when we do the post hoc on this year, we see anomalously low pressure conditions in the North Pacific High sector, or maybe that's the Aleutian low. I'm not sure what you'd exactly call it there. But low atmospheric pressure, which would of course allow the landfalling storm tracks to make landfall over California really strong. And then when we look at the sea surface temperature anomalies, we see what is a very strong response to warm phase events in the El Nino Southern Oscillation. And of course, we know that anomalously warm conditions in the central and the eastern tropical Pacific do have a teleconnection modulation of circulation over the mid latitudes. And so Richard Seeger, who I admire, would argue that the origins of wet years in California can largely be traced back to the tropical Pacific. I would not bet against him. Okay, so that's the kind of synoptic scale setup. I want to try to take it a step further and ask this question: how does climate system variability couple ecosystems and primary productivity across the region? And so I would turn here to work that I was involved in with my colleague, Brian Black, who's now at the University of Arizona. Brian, astutely, along with our colleagues, we've made the argument that anomalous high pressure in the North Pacific sector has some strong impacts on the systems that are actually inverted. And I'm just so fascinated by this. Over land, anomalous high pressure, it suppresses precipitation, as I just showed. It diminishes snowpack stream flow, and reservoir levels. No shocker there. If the ridiculously resilient ridge, as Daniel Swain has called it, is in full effect, reservoir levels will fall. It also, as I've shown with blue oak tree rings, diminishes primary productivity in terrestrial ecosystems. And incidentally, it's been fascinating to see the way that our paper has been picked up and cited by biologists who work in all sorts of floral and faunal systems who are making the same connection, that hydroclimate variability is modulating ecosystem productivity on land. And of course, this triggers a trophic cascade. This is bottom-up trophic cascade, and it's stressful for organisms living in the terrestrial system. In sharp contrast, and what I believe is fascinating, anomalous high pressure in the North Pacific sector, it enhances upwelling in the California current system. Recall the California current is this eastern boundary current, and when you've got anticyclonic activity that facilitates the Ekman spiral, it facilitates the scouring of the continental margin, it facilitates an abundance of nutrient loading into the shallow surface, and it increases primary productivity across the marine system. It actually triggers this beneficial trophic cascade, again, for the marine system. So I just want to like pause and sit with this for a minute. The atmosphere and variability in its pressure is modulating the terrestrial and ecosystem, sorry, the terrestrial and marine ecosystem productivity in an inverse way. And this is particularly the case during these extreme events. And of course, we know that extreme events are often recognized as crises in environmental systems management. And so I think it's fascinating to think about how these extreme events may be cascading through the management systems as well. We showed in this science paper how coupled these can be. We've got a California Current Winter Index. This is a multivariate time series that incorporates upwelling, sea level pressure, and so forth. You can see the blue oak time series. These are otoliths from the split-nose rockfish. The split-nose rockfish grows, increments in its ear bones, calcium carbonate precipitates. You can analyze those to learn how old the fish are. You can also measure the widths of these annual ear bone increments and correlate them. In this case, you got it against trees. So the trees and the fish are growing out of phase, but there is a very strong inverse correlation. It's not just what's going on in the ocean, but things that are happening for the nearshore birds as well. So the lay date for the auklet and the mirror, as well as fledgling success, can all be tracked back to bottom-up ecosystem productivity from the California current. And I don't have time to get too much into the details, but a couple of years later, we published this paper in Global Change Biology, where we correlated the North Pacific high against a whole range of indicators of ecosystem conditions: sea level, upwelling, river discharge, and blue oak tree growth. And the big takeaway here is that from the early period of the observational record to the later period of the observational record, the coupling is intensifying. And so we're trying to make a point there that the climate forcing of the ecosystem seems to be intensifying. And also with recognition and gesturing to the Moran effect, which is this ecological theory that talks about the way that ecosystems and their productivity are linked in a teleconnection way. This means trouble, because we see here that the ecosystems are increasingly synchronized. And when you've got increasing synchrony, that means that across the ecosystems, there's increasing subjectivity to extreme stress. And so we're carrying this work on. Of course, here's a scatter plot of accumulated, no, what is this? Yeah, it's accumulated snowpack. This is from a month ago in the New York Times. This is average snowpack level across the state, and you can't see the scatter plot. If you're looking in the room here, maybe online you can. But they're distinguishing the really low snowpack over the last 3 years with the record high snowpack of the recent year. And so this raises the question, it reifies the question, are extreme events in California becoming more intense? Are they becoming more frequent? And we're trying to work on that. We're also trying to learn more about the proxy system with which we're working. And so a few of us in the room are working on a pilot study to evaluate topoclimate, if you'll allow me to call it that. And so we're thinking about the way that variables like climatic water deficit and temperature change across complex topography. And so we know, for example, that north-facing slopes will be cooler than south-facing slopes in the future. That's a bit of a climatic refugia. And out on the landscape in California, the last few years have been really quite grim, and there are trees dying at the landscape scale. I'm not talking about the conifers that started dying 10 years ago. I'm talking about the oaks. These are our ride or die drought-adapted community members of the ecosystem, and they are really subject increasingly to extreme events and mortality. And so I had the chance to publish an op-ed in the New York Times last summer, and we illustrated this. Nathaniel Lash was the data engineer, and he helped me to kind of piece this out. And so you can see our oak tree rings, which don't look really like conifer tree rings. At high elevations, they're kind of doing okay. At low elevations, we're seeing a couple of things. One, we see a lack of growth in 2014. I alluded to that a moment ago. The other thing that we see, and maybe a keen eye, I see Heidi Root nodding back there, is that at the low elevations, we also see the widest rings of any in the data set. And then a point that my new master's student, Sandy Wong, made recently in the lab group, also the low elevations have the smallest early wood vessels. Of course, these are the conduits that facilitate hydraulic lifting into the crown and the canopy for photosynthesis and respiration. And so there's something going on at low elevations. The trees have this inherent drought adapted trait that allows them to guard against embolism and severe risk of stress from heat and drought. And so thanks to Matt Trumper, who's here with us, who created this figure. Sorry, it's a little washed out. These are basal area increments from our tree ring data. This is hot off the press for site growing at the high elevation limit for the local kind of distribution, all the way down to these sites are at the low elevation limit for the distribution. And one of the things we're seeing in forest systems worldwide is trees are dying. Another complication or wrinkle to that is that they're not all dying. Some trees have greater capacity to withstand drought. And so here we've distinguished the trees that we believe are probably dead by now from those that seem to be thriving. And so there's something going on at the lower elevational limit. There is some sort of plasticity within the population that allows these trees to survive. And we're trying to dig in and work on this. We're trying to understand what potential it might have for our paleoclimate reconstructions. We actually believe this lower elevation limit could provide the best paleo perspective on extreme wetness. You can see we've got some of the highest wet year growth there. And from the land management perspective, this may be a population that ecosystem managers want to pool gene stock from so that they can try to repatriate the globally changing landscapes in California. I'll spare you the details on this particular slide for the sake of time, but I did want to put a plug in for this paleoclimate proposal that's been funded, that we're actively working on by NSF. And we're trying to understand the waveform of the winter season jet stream across North America for the last 500 to 1,000 years. My part of the project is focused on the West Coast and hydroclimate in California for all the ways I've just shown you. And I believe the blue oaks are very tightly coupled to that North Pacific high kind of end of the kind of North American dipole, as my collaborator Simon Wong calls it. He's got this index, the North American dipole, and which is, of course, you know, very tightly aligned with the PNA and, you know, other types of atmospheric circulations indices. I also want to put a plug in for my colleague Steve Volker, who is at Michigan Tech. Steve has worked out this thing that I think is pretty ingenious. He has found that pine trees growing in the microclimate influence of Lake Superior benefit from the thermal memory that the big lake has. Let me say this a little bit differently. Lake Superior, it's a massive water body. It has thermal inertia. The conditions this May and this June will be physically autocorrelated with the conditions from this past winter. And so atmospheric circulation imparts temperature memory into the lake. The lake then bleeds that through physical persistence. And trees growing within about maybe 3 to 5 kilometers of the lake, when they start growing in the spring, they're actually experiencing an echo of what happened in the preceding winter. You tracking with me? Did that make sense? I can walk through it again in the Q&A. But the kicker here is that Steve has convinced himself and reviewers at the NSF that isotopes from the early wood of pine growing near Lake Superior have a very strong physically constrained signal for winter temperature. And so the idea is that we'll use blue oaks from California, pines from Lake Superior to try to understand the waveform of the jet's behavior over the last 500 to 1,000 years. And it's a little bit exciting. I'll call it that. I'll say, okay, so I think I'm on time here. I was targeting, I went a little bit over. California, I would say, is an idealized case study for using tree rings to evaluate climate extremes. It's not the only place it could work. There's excellent potential and relevance for this in Minnesota. Heidi, we should try again on our proposal, I think. In Minnesota, like in California, we've got rising temperatures. We're expecting possible increases in precipitation, and there are strong connections, especially during the early growing season, to the winter jet stream's waveform and position, the amplitude, the wavelength, and its resonance. And then the point I'd like to leave you with here is, I think it's a fascinating twist that the fate of these ancient oaks is so intertwined with the rapidly evolving storyline of climate change, anthropogenic activities, and this emergent question about whether or not we're going to mitigate and how we might adapt going forward. So thanks for your time. Happy to take any questions.
Since you are in the soil department, just like you mentioned about the lake, soil has a capacity to store water. So previous years, water could go on for a couple of years. How do you separate that in the lake?
I wish I had the slides to show you work from Matthew Trumper's master's thesis. Matt's here. Matt and I have been working with a different oak species in California, valley oak, which is water obligate. This is a tree that needs to have its roots in the water table. And Matt showed with this really fascinating transect across the landscape, across a single watershed. Up high in the watershed, the trees are sensitive to interannual scale fluctuations, and down low in the watershed, where there's a natural geologic weir and a water table, that those trees are sensitive to more decadal scale fluctuations, which Matt did a great job of modeling precipitation with a dampening factor, adding the kind of red behavior that you would expect and kind of demonstrating that. So we can use different trees. That's one way to go with this. Another thing I would say is there are big questions about soils and how soils might modulate these relationships. For those of us interested in the longest records, we need to find the trees that are growing the slowest. And we have found those systematically on things like serpentinite soils, on dolostone-derived soils, on volcanic soils. And you guessed it, it's magnesium that seems to be a bit of a common element across these soils that seems to really inhibit primary productivity and slow tree growth. So I'm not sure I answered your question specifically, but the blue oak.
From the previous year presentation.
We did dig soil pits at each of our sites, and we tried to fold those into a factor analysis. It did not see a strong connection between soil characteristics and the effect size of climate recorded in the tree ring widths. I do believe that was a broad brush stroke, and I think there is a lot more under the hood.
I don't want to dominate the discussion, but if you had correlated from the last year's precepts to the subsequent growth.
I see.
Did you look in that?
Is there I think I hear you saying, is there soil moisture carryover from one year to the next? Not in California, not much, not in the systems in which we're working. I was fortunate to be involved in this mega drought review paper with Ben Cook last year in Nature, Earth, and Environment Reviews. And we looked at all of the tree ring data across the world, and California stands out as being almost blue shifted in terms of the interannual variability. There is very little serial correlation in interannual scale hydroclimate in California. And the blue oaks we are sampling seem to be tuned into that.
Just one more question, then I'll have. What about the tree depends on many factors? And one of those factors are diseases and insects, and was there any effect on blue oak?
That's a great question. Yes. And it's messy. And a few ways we try to minimize confounding effects are with replication at the site and across sites. And I think it's worth, mentioning here, if the coefficient of determination in our regression modeling is 0.82, that's 18% of the variance not explained by climate. Now, it's not that high anywhere else, and it's not that high with most of the data. We're all, I should say, from a broader dendroclimatology perspective, if we can explain 50% of the variance with climate, we feel like we've been successful. And in Minnesota, it's probably a little lower than that. And we'd be doing great to explain maybe 40% of the variance. Peter.
Yeah, I mean, the replication that you have in your sample sizes is like, as an ice core paleoclimatologist, makes me incredibly jealous, right? Like you have 50 to 100 data points at any of your individual data points. In ice core science, we have one, maybe with some shorter cores nearby if we're lucky. But so my question is, if you are thinking about evaluating climate extremes with a paleoclimate network that extends back in time and has very good spatial coverage, one of the challenges we have in Antarctica is that the number of records you have usually is maximum in like the 1980s, 1990s. In the recent decade, you haven't gone back to your tree sites, you haven't gone back to your ice core sites to update to the present. Is that a challenge for you, where you do have good observational climate in North America, which I'm also jealous of, but we don't have that in Antarctica? But is that a challenge?
It is, and I failed to mention that the thing that the students in my group have been so amazing with this semester, thank you, Andrew, Jack, Sandy, is that we're updating about 15 of the key sites. And so this was a project that's been COVID delayed, but we've been processing, I think, about 500 tree core specimens through. So we'll have all of those data updated through 2021 or 2022. And for some of those key sites, which I showed, if I can squeeze like an extra field trip out of the grant, we'll be back to have the year 2023. I'm really interested to see how the trees respond to this potentially record wet year. So yeah, and I should also just mention, I didn't go into it, but if you go to the lab group website, you can see all the pubs. These blue oak data have been kind of maybe the most used for reconstructing anything under the sun. I mean, we've done snowpack, atmospheric circulation, precipitation, soil moisture, salinity in San Francisco Bay, the position of the null zone in San Francisco Bay, which actually maps back onto the estuary capacity for primary productivity, California current upwelling. And so that's a great question. Marty Ralph declined my request to host me for a postdoc, but there are 2 new papers out by collaborators of mine who are showing some capacity at some of the sites for atmospheric rivers. And this is what I'm really, when I look at this, I kind of am curious. We've got these, it's tricky. On the real wet side of the equation, it's tricky. Another thing is that these trees have been referred to as integrating pluviometers. Atmospheric rivers are multi-day events. They sometimes bunch up like a traffic jam in a season. Sometimes you get a couple spread out over the season. What these trees care about is what's the profile of water from, the time they start growing until the time they run out of steam. And so I've been kind of brainstorming with Matt and Andy Wickard and want to talk with y'all about the different moisture balance pathways, the range of pathways that produce the end that seems to matter for the trees. And so it's a sticky wicket, but there's opportunity and a lot of interest. Heidi.
It's really important that the phenology and the seasonality characteristic of percent, and then also how it's changing. So postdoc we had here at Gonzalez, you might interact with it. we published a paper this last year on the source of atmospheric rivers and the temperature. And sort of which atmospheric rivers are more moist, and does temperature and origin matter in terms of landfall characteristics across all of California, all the way up into British Columbia. There's some interesting things because of the seasonality that I think you might be able to back out with in regards to sort of atmospheric rivers and some of those anomalous years.
Matt?
figuring out the origin,
Yeah.
but is it an atmospheric river? There's probably some way to get at that.
I missed that paper, but I'd love to pick your brain about that. We were at an oak conference in San Luis Obispo, Matt and I, and we were talking with David Ackerley about this business. Something is going on with these low elevation trees. They have the capacity to respond during, what's that, 2019? They had the capacity to respond during crazy wet years. Is it the physical system? Is it, soil moisture, the root system? I mean, is it genetic? I mean, there's so many big questions, but if we can dig into this and figure it out, we might have a chance to better develop a network that would be suited to the atmospheric river kind of estimate problem set, which is always going to be complicated, but it's a pretty fun thing to be working in. And, I didn't show the climate anomalies for 2023, but what a fascinating phase of North America climate. It's been this kind of incredibly cool phase over the entire West, and it's been warm over the East. It's been wet over the West. And if you look at the 30 versus 90-day anomaly maps, you can see how the face of the circulation wave kind of migrated across Minnesota. So Minnesota kind of had a little bit of both. And yeah, deeply interested. Okay, we did it. Thanks so much, you all. Appreciate it.